The key would not turn in my own front door, and for a moment I thought my hands were simply still weak from the surgery, until I noticed the doormat was not mine and the curtains behind the glass were the wrong color entirely. A moving truck sat in my driveway where my car should have been, its ramp down, two men carrying a sofa I had never seen through the doorway of the house I had lived in for 31 years. I stood on the sidewalk in the cardigan the hospital had sent me home in, my discharge papers still folded inside my purse alongside a small bottle of heart medication, and I could not make sense of what I was looking at. I am Vivian Chalmers, I am 68 years old, and I lived on Larkin Street in Sacramento, California. 10 days earlier I had collapsed in my kitchen with what turned out to be a blocked artery, and I had spent most of that week sedated in the cardiac intensive care unit, drifting in and out of consciousness, tubes in my arm. Machines keeping track of a heart that had nearly stopped working. My son Bradley had been the one listed as my emergency contact. He had visited twice that I could recall, both times briefly, both times leaving before I was fully awake enough to hold a real conversation, and both times leaving without once mentioning the house. I had assumed, in the fog of recovery, that he was simply overwhelmed, the way any adult child might be watching a parent go through something frightening. Standing on my own sidewalk looking at strangers moving furniture into my house, I understood that assumption had been badly wrong. A woman I did not recognize stepped out onto the porch, saw me standing there, and asked, not unkindly, if she could help me with something. I told her this was my house. She looked confused, then apologetic, and said her husband had closed on the property just 4 days earlier, that the paperwork had all been in order, that surely there was some misunderstanding. She introduced herself as Dana Reyes and said her husband Marcus had found the listing through an agent who assured them everything was straightforward, an older woman downsizing, a quick and simple sale, nothing unusual at all. I asked her what paperwork, and she said she did not know the details, that Marcus had handled all of it directly. I called Bradley from the sidewalk, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition, and when he finally answered, his voice was calm in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. He said the house had been sold, that I had signed the papers myself, and asked, almost gently, if I truly did not remember. I told him I remembered nothing of the kind, that I had been unconscious for most of that week, that there was no possible way I had signed anything. He said stress could do strange things to memory, that perhaps the medication had affected me more than I realized, and something in the practiced ease of that explanation told me he had prepared this exact conversation in advance. I asked him directly, standing there on the sidewalk with strangers stepping around me carrying boxes, where all of this had even come from, since I had never once discussed selling that house, not with him, not with anyone. He said it had all happened quickly because a good offer came in, and he had not wanted to bother me with details while I was recovering, that he had simply handled things the way he thought I would have wanted, and that framing of protection rather than betrayal was the same framing he had always used whenever he wanted control over something without having to ask permission for it. Pauline Osgood, who had lived next door to me for over 20 years, came hurrying across her lawn when she saw me standing frozen on the sidewalk and pulled me gently by the arm toward her own porch, away from the strangers still carrying boxes past us. She told me the moving truck for the new family had arrived only 4 days after the ambulance took me away, which struck her as strange even before she knew anything else was wrong, because in her experience a normal home sale, with inspections and financing and closing dates, simply did not move that fast, not even close. She said she had assumed, at the time, that perhaps I had made arrangements before my collapse, some plan she was not aware of, and had not thought to question it until she saw my face on the sidewalk moments earlier. I sat on her porch swing, my legs unsteady beneath me, and tried to reconstruct a timeline that made any sense at all. I had gone into the hospital on a Tuesday. According to Pauline, movers had already been unloading furniture into my house by the following Monday. 6 days. I had barely been conscious for 4 of them, and the 2 days I had been awake, I had been groggy, confused, focused entirely on whether my heart would hold, not on real estate, not on paperwork, not on anything beyond the next breath. Todd Whitfield, The real estate agent whose name I recognized from a sign that had briefly gone up in my yard years earlier when a neighbor sold their house was the agent listed on the paperwork Bradley eventually forwarded to me, reluctantly, after I called him 3 more times demanding to see it. The signature at the bottom of the sale agreement looked close to mine, close enough that a stranger glancing at it might not question it, but something about the slant of the letters felt subtly wrong to my own eye. The way handwriting always feels wrong when you are the one who actually wrote it and someone else is trying to imitate it. I noticed too that the document referenced an old power of attorney form, one I remembered signing nearly 6 years earlier during a minor surgery scare that had turned out to be nothing, a form I had assumed had long since expired and meant nothing anymore. The date beside the signature placed it on a Thursday, the exact day, according to the hospital records I requested that same afternoon, that I had been fully sedated following an emergency procedure, unresponsive to voice, unable to hold a pen, let alone read and sign a legal document transferring ownership of my own home. I sat with that piece of paper in my lap on Pauline's porch, staring at a signature that was and was not mine, and understood for the first time that my son had not been overwhelmed by my hospitalization at all. He had been using it. I thought of Cassidy, my daughter, who lived 2 states away and had only heard secondhand from Bradley that I was recovering well and handling things, a phrase that now felt engineered to keep her from asking too many questions until the sale was already finished. I picked up my phone to call her, my finger hovering over her name, uncertain whether I even had the strength yet to explain what I barely understood myself, and uncertain, too, whether she would believe me over her own brother without seeing the paperwork with her own eyes first. I called Cassidy that evening from Pauline's guest room, and she was quiet for a long time after I explained everything, quiet in the way people go quiet when they are recalculating a person they thought they understood. She said Bradley had told her I was recovering well, handling paperwork calmly, that there was nothing for her to worry about, and hearing that phrase repeated back to me made something in my chest tighten harder than the surgery had. She asked me to send her a photograph of the signature immediately, and I heard her go quiet again on the other end of the line, studying it, before she said softly that it did not look right to her either. That she had seen my handwriting on birthday cards for 30 years, and this was close, but not quite it, close the way a forgery is close rather than the way the truth is close. She flew in 2 days later, and together we drove to Todd Whitfield's office, where he greeted us with the practiced warmth of a man used to smoothing over uncomfortable questions. When I asked him directly whether he had verified my identity or my consent before listing the property, he said Bradley had presented himself as holding power of attorney and had provided a signed document to that effect. One Todd admitted he had not independently confirmed was still valid. I told him that document was 6 years old, tied to a minor procedure I had fully recovered from, and had never been renewed or reactivated for anything since. Todd's expression shifted, the warmth draining slightly, and he said he had processed the sale quickly because Bradley had emphasized the family's urgent financial need and had offered him a larger commission for expediting the closing, a detail he clearly regretted mentioning the moment it left his mouth. Marcus Reyes, the buyer, called me himself 2 days after that conversation, his voice careful, almost apologetic, and asked if we could meet in person rather than continue over the phone. He told me that while beginning renovations in what was now his home office, he had found a locked drawer built into the closet, one the previous listing had never mentioned, and inside it he had found my hospital identification bracelet, a folder of property tax notices addressed to me that I had never received, and a handwritten letter in my own hand, tucked away years earlier during a moment of quiet worry, stating plainly that I never wanted that house sold while I was alive. That it was the one thing I wanted to leave entirely to my own judgment. Marcus said reading that letter had made him physically ill, understanding he might be standing in a home that had been taken rather than sold, and he told me later that Dana had wept reading it too, sitting on the floor of a bedroom that no longer felt entirely like theirs. He had reached out to Renata Cole, the ICU nurse whose name appeared on my hospital paperwork, after finding her card among the tax notices, and she confirmed, plainly and without hesitation, that I had been sedated and entirely unresponsive on the exact date the sale documents claimed I had signed them. A fact she was willing to state clearly because medical records did not lie about vital signs and consciousness levels the way people could lie about intentions. Marcus said he confronted Bradley directly after that call, and Bradley had tried to insist I was lucid enough that week to understand what I was doing, that the medication only affected me later, but Kristen, standing beside him, had grown visibly nervous, correcting small details of the timeline that did not match what Bradley was claiming, contradictions Marcus noticed immediately because he had already spoken to Renata and already knew which version of events was true. It came out over the following weeks, through a lawyer Cassidy insisted we hire, that Bradley had used the outdated power of attorney form specifically because he knew a rush sale would be harder to unwind once money changed hands, and that he had offered Todd a higher commission precisely to discourage him from asking the kinds of questions that would have exposed the timeline immediately. Our lawyer explained that expired or improperly invoked power of attorney documents are challenged more often than people realize, but rarely with this much independent corroboration arriving all at once: a nurse, a neighbor, a buyer, and hospital vital sign records that left no room for interpretation. Bradley's debts, it turned out, had been mounting for over a year, debts he had never once mentioned to me, tied to a business venture with a college friend that had quietly failed months earlier. And the sale of my house had cleared nearly all of them within days of closing, money that moved through his accounts faster than most legitimate transactions ever do. Marcus told me, sitting across from me at Pauline's kitchen table, that he could not in good conscience keep a home he now understood had been taken from a woman while she was unconscious in a hospital bed, and he placed my old house key on the table between us, the same brass key I had carried on my ring for 3 decades, and told me plainly that he was sorry for whatever role he had unknowingly played in this, and that the house was mine again the moment the legal process allowed it. I did not scream at my son when the truth finally came out in full. I did not need to. I simply let the documented facts, the hospital records, the nurse's statement, the outdated power of attorney, the commission Todd could no longer explain away, speak for themselves in the legal proceedings that followed. Bradley faced consequences he could not talk his way out of this time, financial penalties and a fraud finding that followed him well beyond our family, and our relationship, what remained of it, changed permanently and did not return to what it had been. Cassidy stayed close throughout, and something between us grew steadier for having gone through it together, the two of us learning, in the worst possible way, exactly who could be relied upon. I moved back into the house on Larkin Street 2 months later, into rooms that still held traces of a family that briefly lived there without ever knowing the truth of how they came to be inside them, and I found, tucked back where I had left it years earlier, the same handwritten letter Marcus had returned to me along with the key. What I learned is that trust given freely to family is often the very thing people exploit, precisely because no one expects to have to verify the people who are supposed to protect them, and that a person recovering in a hospital bed is never too weak to be worth telling the truth to. If you have ever had someone close to you use a moment of weakness as an opportunity rather than a reason for compassion, I hope the truth finds its way to you the way mine did, through people who had no reason to lie and every reason to simply tell you what they saw.